to ask questions. And that is the bit I like best. So you think you can catch me out on a question, then go for it. So any question at all about Brownsea, Baden Powell, start of scouting, that's my bag. So we've used the word Brownsea. So I hope you've got some idea of what Brownsea is. Is it a plane? Is it a bird? No, it's an island. And why is it important to scouting? Well, to answer that question, we have to go way, way back and talk about the person who founded scouting, who I hope you all know his name. So I can't hear you, but I can see your mouth moving. So let's say it all together. His name is Baden Powell. Okay, so Baden Powell has got a long history, and we haven't got much time to talk about all of that. So we have to fast forward to when he was in the army, and in the year 1900, he was born in 1857. So that's 43 years later. He was sent by the British government to South Africa because the British government knew that there was going to be a war between the British people who lived in South Africa and the Dutch German people who lived in South Africa, and they were called the Boers. They weren't boring, but they were called the Boers. So they lived in South Africa, the Boers, and so did the British people. And they'd had a bit of a falling out because by that time we'd abolished slavery and they hadn't. So once upon a time, they all used to live together in South Africa, but because we didn't allow slavery, then the Boer people left and they founded their own countries in the south of Africa. One of them was called the Transvaal and the other was called the Orange Free State. Now, we had a man living in South Africa at the time who got to be quite famous, and he was called Cecil Rhodes. And he was a very, very rich man because he owned all the gold fields and he wanted to own all the diamond fields and he wanted Britain to own all of South Africa. Now, as it happens, most of the gold and diamond fields are in the bit where the Boers lived. So there was a conflict brewing, and the British government knew that there was going to be a war. So they got this army captain at the time to go to South Africa to raise an army to go and fight the Boers in this bit of a local insurrection. They didn't think it was going to be very much because the Boers didn't even have an army. They were just farmers. So Baden Powell went to South Africa in 1899 and he raised an army of local people. He only took with him 12 officers and he got himself to the borders of the Transvaal in the British part of Africa, and the nearest town was a place which I want you to remember called Mafeking. So the Boer people living about 7 or 8 miles in the Transvaal on the border with the British part, they issued an ultimatum. Now, those of you who have done history of the First World War and Second World War will know that they were started by ultimatums. So the Boers said, if the British don't take their soldiers, including Baden Powell, away by a certain time on a certain date, we will be at war. So they didn't. Baden Powell didn't go anywhere. And so the Boers declared war on the British. So Baden Powell took his men, half of his men, into Mafeking, and the other half, who were cavalrymen, stayed outside, and they had a roving commission to go wherever there was trouble. So the Boers quickly came over the border from the Transvaal, dragging with them big, heavy, modern guns, and Baden Powell was locked up inside this little town of Mafeking, and he only had old-fashioned guns that he could get, because he didn't take any from Britain, and the only ones he could take with him were 4 7-pound guns that could throw a shell about 1,000 yards. But the Boers had very, very modern guns, including one called the Long Tom that could throw a 94-pound shell 5 miles. And they had 6,000 men surrounding the besieged Mafeking. And Baden Powell had 1,000 soldiers inside besieged Mafeking with the help of the few hundred townspeople who weren't trained soldiers And the soldiers that he had, he'd only had a little time to train. So here's the thing. You're thinking, who could have possibly have won that conflict? 6,000 men, modern guns, inside, 1,000 soldiers and very antiquated old-fashioned guns. Who could have won? Well, you know, I can talk about Mafeking for days. I've been there. I've written 3 books about Mafeking. It is the most fascinating thing. And it saddens me that I can only talk to you about Mafeking tonight for a few minutes, because we've got to get on with the story. But the story wouldn't exist without Mafeking. Right, so Baden Powell's locked up in this besieged town of Mafeking with all these guns and soldiers around the outside, and they ought to have just marched in and won, but they didn't, because he used his brain, because that's how he trained his soldiers. Although he was in the British Army, he wasn't in favour of men marching up and down in red coats. No, he was in favour of training people to use their intelligence, to be able to deduce what was going on in the landscape, to be able to estimate how many foreign soldiers there were and what they were doing. And he wrapped all that knowledge up in a book called Reconnaissance and Scouting, which was a book for army soldiers in 1895. So he was already known for scouting, but it wasn't the sort of scouting we do. It was army scouting. But he used some of those methods with his soldiers and the townspeople inside Mafeking. There were so many Boer soldiers on the outside that he needed every single soldier that he had to man the trenches around this little town of Mafeking. It had a border of about 5 miles on the edge of the Kalahari Desert. And so he needed all the soldiers that he'd got. So one of the first things he did was he used a squad of boys that existed before he got there, and they were called the Mafeking Cadets. They were like army cadets. And so Baden Powell latched onto these squad of boys, and he said, right, I think I can train those boys, or I can get one of my men to train those boys to be very, very useful and to deliver messages to the outlying posts on the perimeter forts. And to start with, at the very start of the siege, they did that on horseback. But that didn't work for very long. Why do you think that was? Well, I'll tell you. That's because they had to eat the horses, because they were besieged. They were being starved. There was nobody letting anything out of Mafeking. Nobody could get in and out of Mafeking, except the native people who'd lived there all their lives, and they could get out at night. But white British people couldn't get out, and the Boers were trying to starve us into submission. So Baden Powell used these Mafeking cadets as runners to get the messages to the outlying forces. Now, as I've said to you, I could go on for days about what exciting things happened in Mafeking. But the siege went on and on and on, the longest running siege in the Second Boer War. It lasted for 217 days. Now, inside Mafeking, locked up with Baden Powell, were 12 newspaper reporters who all knew there was going to be a war, so they'd gone there deliberately. And they were sending out messages with these natives who could get out at night without being caught by the Boers, because if there hadn't been, they would have been killed or even flayed alive. And if you don't know what flayed alive means, then look it up in the dictionary, because it's terrible. Right. So these newspaper reporters were sending out messages every day to the nearest telegraph station 27 miles away by native runner. And these natives went out at night to the telegraph station. The telegraph station went to the coast. There was a telegraph line going all the way down to Cape Town. And believe it or not, in 1900, there was an undersea telegraph cable going from South Africa to England. And there was another telegraph cable going from England to America and to Canada. And by that way, whatever was happening in gallant little Mafeking, people all over the British Empire and in America knew what was happening. So all the ruses of Baden Powell to stop these 6,000 Boers from just rushing over and capturing the place, tricks that you can call them, were all being relayed to the people all over the world. Now, we haven't got time to go into all of these ruses because we're not really here to talk about Mafeking. We're here to talk about Brownsea. But the fact is, Baden Powell's ruses worked, and he soon became the most famous soldier in the British Empire. Some people say the most famous person, excepting for Queen Victoria herself. And the really height of his fame came after the 217th day, when the cavalry came over the hill with Baden Powell's brother, who was called Baden Powell, and relieved Mafeking. And the relief of Mafeking was the most fantastic thing that had happened in the war, because up until that time we weren't winning at all. And this wasn't really winning. This was only relieving a tiny little town on the edge of nowhere. But it was the first good news. And the news spread because of the telegraphs all throughout the British Empire. And Baden Powell became the most famous soldier in the British Empire. And he stayed in South Africa doing lots of interesting things that we haven't got time to talk about until 1904, when he came home. And the rich and the famous people in Britain who owned all the big houses, what they wanted was Baden Powell to come and talk to them at their weekend parties in the big house about just what he did to be able to stop Mafeking from being taken by the Boers. So he was able to tell them about the Mafeking cadets and all the other ruses that he did. And at one of these big parties was a very rich newspaper publisher called Pearson. And he was very interested in this story of the Mafeking cadets. So he said, "You mean to tell me, Baden Powell, that you can take ordinary boys and you can train them up and they can become useful citizens?" "Exactly that," said Baden Powell. So Pearson said, "Well, look here now, Baden Powell, I'm going to give you £5,000, which in 1900 would have bought a village as big as the one you live in. £5,000. You could have bought a house in your village in 1900 for £60. £5,000 if you form an organisation such as you are talking about, where young people can become very useful." So that was the challenge laid down to Brownsea, laid down to Baden Powell. Now, the thing is, he was a bachelor. And apart from being in the army, he lived all alone with his mum. So what does a bachelor who lives all alone with his mum when he's not in the army know about boys of scout age? And the answer is not a lot. But all his life, he'd gathered stories from all the places he'd been in the army, and that was a lot, about how young people grow up to be useful people in the tribes. He learnt about the Knights of the Bushido in Japan, and he learnt about the Zulus in Africa, and he'd kept all these stories in this tin ammunition box. So he got them all out and he started to write a book. And this man Pearson had promised him £5,000, not for himself, but for starting this movement. But the one thing that Baden Powell didn't have was experience of scouts, of young people of scout age. Mafeking cadets, well, he's sort of started the Mafeking cadets. It was there already, and he gave instructions as to how they should be trained, but he was the commanding officer. He didn't have a lot of time for playing with young people. He was the commanding officer. So what he wanted to do was to put all of his theories about how you could train young people to be useful citizens to the test. So at one of these big houses he went to in Knocklofty in Ireland, he met a couple of people there, married couple, and they said, he was talking about, I need to find a place where I can try out some experiments with young people to see if my theories work. I want to put them to the test. But it's vital, he said, that the Joe public isn't allowed in, and particularly not allowed in is newspapers reporters, because he hated newspapers reporters because they always got the things wrong. When he was involved in Mafeking, they always told lies about what was going on. So he actually called them a very unpleasant word. He called them vermin. You know what vermin are? Rats. So he didn't like them at all. So these people called the Van Rolts, they had a Dutch name, Van Rolts. They were very rich people. And they'd got a big house in Ireland, which is where Baden Powell was. And they'd got a big house in London. But more interestingly to Baden Powell, they'd got an island off the south coast of England called Brownsea. And here is a picture. Can we see the picture, Chris?
Yeah, drop him down a little bit. Yeah, that's it.
You see, it's not a very big island, is it? That is Brownsea Island, and it's only about 250 yards from the coast in one place at Sandbanks, and it's about 2.5 miles a bit further on at Poole. So the Van Rolts offered Baden Powell this island to carry out his experiment because it was an island. So Baden Powell wrote to all the editors of the newspapers and said, look, we're having this experiment. I don't want you to send any newspaper reporters because sometimes experiments don't work. But if it does, and you don't send reporters, I promise you, I will tell you all about the experiment. And most of the newspaper editors stuck to their bargain. So now Baden Powell has got an island, Brownsea Island, in which to carry out his great experiment. What does he want now?
Kids.
New car, fish and chips? No, he wants boys. That's what he wants. Well, how's he going to get boys? Because he's a bachelor. So he turned to one of his old acquaintances that ran one of the best youth organisations in Britain, one of the biggest youth organisations before Scouting, and that organisation was called the Boys Brigade. And like Scouts today, there were boys' brigades all over the country. And the nearest boys' brigade to Brownsea Island was in the towns of Poole and Bournemouth. So Baden Powell asked the boys' brigade if they would lend him some boys. And he wanted ordinary boys. Baden Powell called these town boys, boys like you, whose mums, well, the mums would have been home in those days. They didn't go to work, but the dads would have been shopkeepers or working in the factory or working on the farm, ordinary people. And he asked for 12 of these boys. He actually got 10. And he then asked the children, his friends, if he could borrow their children. Now, Baden Powell, although his father died when he was only 3, and his mother was quite poor, he lived in a very posh world, and he'd gone to a boarding school, and most of his friends were from that background. So he asked them if he could borrow some of their children, and they came from some of the richest people in the country, millionaires' children, the sons of lords. Now, this was not an accident. This was deliberate. This was the great experiment that happened on Brownsea. And this is why Scouting is so good as it is today, because the posh word for it is inclusive, which you will know means for everybody, for rich people, for poor people, and now for girls, it's for everybody. Now, that didn't happen very often in 1907, which is the time we're talking about. Rich people didn't associate with poor people. Rich people living in castles, such as some of the people whose sons went to Brownsea Island, their children didn't mix with the gamekeepers' children. Oh, goodness me, no. They went off to their posh schools. They never ever met local village children. And village children, if they saw these people go by in their posh carriages and Rolls Royces, they would doff their caps. But this was an experiment into social inclusivity. And the world had not seen anything like it before. So what sort of things did Baden Powell get his boys to do on Brownsea Island? The first thing he did They didn't wear Scout uniform. Why was that? Well, I can't hear you because you're all muted, so I'm going to have to tell you. Because there weren't any Scouts. This was an experiment to see if you could have Scouts. So there was no Scout uniforms, there were no Scouts, there were no Scout leaders. There were just these children from the Boys Brigade and these children from the rich and famous. So they all wore their ordinary clothes. So the working class boys wore very rough clothes, and the posh kids, well, they wore better clothes. But they all wore this badge. Can we see this badge, Chris?
Yeah, if you drop it down a little bit.
There we go.
Yeah.
Now, this is a replica, and I'll tell you why it's a replica in a minute. But there's two parts to this badge. Do you see? There's the fleur-de-lis at the top, which is the same as on your World Scout emblem that you wear on your uniform. And is worn by 47 million people all across the world. That was the first class badge and the tenderfoot badge, depending on its size. The tenderfoot badge was the joining badge, the first badge. And underneath is this crescent-shaped badge. That's the second class badge. So the tenderfoot badge was little, but looked like that. Then there's the second class badge, and this was the first class badge. First class badge when I was a scout, and right at the start of scouting. Not that it's one and the same, because I actually wasn't there in 1908. So he made them these badges, which they had to earn. Now, I don't know if you can see these little pictures. Can we see the little pictures, Chris?
Yes. Yeah,
can you see the second class badge in the hat?
Yes, just
can
about.
You see the one on the shoulder, which is the two badges together, of the boy with fair hair?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Right. Well, they're the badges that Baden Powell made. He cut those out of brass with his own hand. And this boy here, with a black pullover with the badges on his shoulder, his name is Donald. How old do you think Donald is? Well, I can't hear you because you're all muted, but you're telling me you think he's 9. You'd be right. 9 years old. And he was Baden Powell's nephew, because his father had died. He was an orphan. His mother still lived, but Baden Powell had decided to take him along to the camp. So he was the youngest person there. And he's never included in any of the lists of the campers. But he should be, because we can see from the photograph, look, that he earned his first and second class badge. So he took part in all of the activities. So then Baden Powell introduced them to all the sorts of activities that you would find fantastic. Now, here's a picture here of a postcard that was made in 1908, the year after Brownsea Island. Can we see what's going on there? Baden Powell got 2 boats, real harpoon, a length of rope, and a boy stood in the bow of the boat while the other boys rowed out to logs that had got a tin fins on and were meant to be a whale. And then a boy stood in the bow and he hurled his harpoon into the log, and it was the first crew to capture the whale. Do you think that sounds good fun? Do you think health and safety would allow that today?
No.
Do you think they're doing any contingency planning? I don't think so. But that's the sort of fun that he had. But Baden Powell was a great educator. He took great interest in how children learned. And he did lots of surprising things. He said, right. He said, after dinner, everybody is going to lay down and have an hour's rest and think about what they did in the morning. Because in the morning, they worked in small groups as patrols. Chris, what are your patrols called?
We got 2 sets of groups. So we've got
in Llanrafn we have eagles, wolves, lions, and stags.
Yeah, and we've got the same in Culliam, but we've got kestrels, I believe, as well.
The very first scout patrols in the world were found on Brownsea Island in 1907, and Baden Powell called them curlews, ravens, wolves, and bulls, and they had patrol leaders, and we'll be talking about one of those in a bit. So In the morning, what they did was they did an exercise, maybe an observation exercise, maybe a tracking exercise, maybe a game, but all the games had a purpose, and they worked in patrols, actually doing something. And then they had the midday meal, and then after the meal, they laid down for an hour and did nothing, because Baden Powell thought, and modern educational scientists have borne this out, that if you rest your brain for an hour after the midday meal, it has a chance to consolidate what you've been thinking about. So then in the afternoon, they went off and put those skills into practice. I've missed out the important bit, because the night before they had a campfire, and Baden Powell was brilliant at campfires, because he used to tell them the stories of all these tribes people and how they learnt the skills in their native countries. But then, as the campfire flames were receded and the ashes were glowing and it was getting darker, and the pine woods behind this little camp on Brownsea Island were getting darker, and the mist was coming off of the sea and the waves were slowly rolling in, Baden Powell would stand up amongst them and he would mesmerize them, because he had that ability and that power. If Baden Powell spoke, you listened, because he had that charismatic personality. And he told them very, very briefly what it was that they were going to be doing tomorrow morning. And then as they wended their way back from the campfire up to their tent in Brownsea, ringing in their ears was what it was that they were going to do in the morning. And in the morning, they worked on these skills in these small patrols, and then in the afternoon, they did these things practically. Now, modern educationally trained people like your good teachers know that that is the best possible way of imparting information. And Baden Powell wasn't a teacher, he was a soldier. But he made it his business to find out how children learned and what interested them. And that's another reason why scouting was such a good thing. Now, I've showed you this badge that he cut out here. Have a look at this badge here. Because they're Army Scout badges that Baden Powell designed for his soldiers. So we'll be talking about those in a minute. Now, when he was a soldier, he got lots of interesting jobs to do because he was an officer. And one thing he had to do was to go around chasing up natives, what they called them in those days, who were murdering British farmers, British settlers. Nowadays, we would say they were freedom fighters for their nation. And so they were. But in those far off days, all that was bothered about was they were murdering British people, and so they'd got to be chased. So Baden Powell went off with his patrol in this particular part of Africa called the Sombaloo, or I think that's how you pronounce it, the Sombaloo Forest. And of course, they couldn't take with them wagons of food. They had to shoot and catch and shoot their own food if they were going to survive. So they came across this clearing, and there in the clearing were 2 kudu. What's a kudu, I hear you saying? A kudu is the biggest antelope in Africa. It stands at the shoulder, 6 foot high, so its head comes up from its shoulder, and on top of its head are the 2 most enormous horns that you have ever seen. And here is one. Do we see it, Chris, in his head?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, very good.
So imagine that sticking out there.
And another one the other side.
Sticking out there. Now, I've seen kudu in Africa, and they are quite ferocious beasts. Now, Baden Powell killed this kudu, and a lot of people would throw up their hands in despair today. What is Baden Powell, who invented scouts, where the law was a scout is a kind to animals, used to be in the Scout 10 laws. What's he doing? Killing a kudu. And the answer is quite simple. He was killing it to eat it, because that's what you had to do when you were in the wild and you'd got no food because there was no refrigerators. So he had to do that. But he kept the kudu horn. So guess what? Being a conservationist, he had to find a use for the kudu horn. And the natives in in the tribes in South Africa, and I've been to some of these tribes and visited them, they still use the kudu horn today. I went to one village and the postman used the kudu horn, and he blew the kudu horn, as you can have. There's a hole in it just here. Look, do we see the hole? Now, I've got a grandson who, when he was 9, he could play a kudu horn, but I never have been. It just sounds like a terrible, rude noise when I do it. Terrible. But he could make a sound. He could make a sound. And the postman in this village that I went to in Africa, he was using this to tell the people he'd arrived, and they all had to go and fetch their letters. He didn't put them through the letterboxes. And then in another village, they used the kudu horn to make the music for the tribal dances. So Baden Powell brought that kudu horn back, and he used it on Brownsea Island. And then forever on in Baden Powell's scouting life, whatever jamboree he went to, he took the kudu horn with him. Bit unpopular when he blew it at 6:30 in the morning to wake up the campers. Okay, so there were 22 people on Brownsea Island that Baden Powell took with him, including his nephew Donald. You won't find that written down in any book, but that is the case. But there was one boy who lived on Brownsea who was the son of the gamekeeper, and he was allowed to join in the fun and the games. Now, somewhere here, I've got his photograph. Not a very good photograph, but there it is. Do we see this boy with the bag?
Yeah.
Well, this boy with the bag, he's playing Hare and Hounds. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's sort of a tracking game. In the bag, he would have strips of paper. And when he was going over country where his footprints wouldn't leave a mark, he left a trail of paper. And then the patrol set off behind him and had to catch him. So it was very important to have an impartial person doing this. So who better than the gamekeeper's son, who wasn't really part of the scene? And how typical of Baden Powell to include him in the program that was going on. So there were 23 boys on Brownsea Island. The senior patrol leader on Brownsea was a boy called Bob Roughton. Bob Roughton. If you were a boy on Brownsea, one of these 23 boys, you stood an equal chance of living to be a right old age. Some of them lived to be 98 and 99 years old, but that's half of them. The other half all died before they were 23. Now, why do you think that was? Do I see any like of a spark? Why do you think these boys died before the age of 23? Well, if they were between 11 and 15 in 1908, what happened in 1914?
Somebody said it.
Somebody
said it. The First World War, where they all became soldiers. This is Bob Roughton as a soldier. And if you were unlucky enough to volunteer for the British Army in 1914, and so stood all 4 years of the First World War, there was a 1 in 3 chance that you were going to get killed. And that is exactly the statistics for the campers on Brownsea Island. 1/3 of them died in the trenches in the First World War. And Baden Powell's second camp in 1908, 1/3 of them exactly died in the First World War. So they either lived to be a right old age or they died in the First World War. And this was Baden Powell's senior patrol leader. I wonder what you think this is that I've got in my hand. Do we see it, Chris?
Yeah, I can see it.
Can we read the name on it?
Not quite. Whole.
It says the boy's name.
Oh, there we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, Roughton.
Roughton, yeah. Lieutenant.
M. Roughton. Musgrove, the M stood for. What do you think it is? Well, I'm going to tell you, it's a bit gruesome. This is his dog tag that he wore round his neck. And when he was killed, somebody had to take it off from round his neck. And here it is here. The senior patrol leader on Brownsea, this is his dog tag. So, now, this camp on Brownsea Island, it was an experiment. Did it work or didn't it work? Well, of course it worked, because if it didn't work, you wouldn't be sitting here. So, 1907, Baden Powell came back from Brownsea, got on with the job of writing Scouting for Boys, which was published in January 1908 in 6 parts, costing 4p each, so that scouts could buy them. Not a book, more like a magazine or a comic, so that scouts could afford it. And Scouting for Boys was a great success. So in January 1908, Baden Powell started the Scout movement based on the success he had with 22 boys he took to Brownsea Island and the one boy who lived there before, 23 in total. And what did I tell you just a moment ago? How many scouts are there across the world today? 49 million. How many scouts have there been alive since 1908? Who knows? But the estimate is somewhere in the region of 250 million. And we're only talking about scouts. What about the Girl Guides, or the Guides as they call them today? So one man on one island made this movement that you can be very, very proud to belong to. And you now know the origin of the Scout movement. You know the origin of the fleur-de-lis badge, which you wear in your world badge. And I now am ready for you to ask me some intelligent questions.
Okay then, guys. If you'd like to put your hand up, and we'll mute you, okay, so that you can unmute you, sorry, so that you can ask your questions. All right, so can you put your hand up like that to say, hold on, I'm over there. Just go like that. Okay, so
Theo and Ben.
yeah.
Hello?
Where did you get the dog?
Yeah. You're at, is it Theo, is it?
Hello, Theo.
What question have you got?
Where did you get the dog tag from?
Can you repeat that, Chris?
You said, where did you get the dog tag from?
Well, it's a terrible thing to say, but sometimes over the course of a long period of time, sometimes families don't survive, do they? Because Bob Broughton was the only son in his family and he died, didn't he? So that meant there were 2 girls, and the girls got married and they both of them left the country. But before they did, they bought their mother a photograph album, in which that photograph album was all sorts of things relating to the girls' history and Bob Broughton's history. But then there was nobody left in the family. It came up for auction and I bought it. So sometimes amazing things like that do happen, which I'm very glad you asked me that question, because here's some other very, very rare things here that are very interesting. Now, how would you describe the Brownsea camp? What would you say it was?
Brownsea. Unmute everyone.
Yeah.
What was the Brownsea camp? Do you have any takers for that? Who thinks it was a scout camp?
It wasn't technically, was it? Because none of them said their promise.
That's the right answer. What's your name, young man?
Taylor, hello.
Taylor, that is fantastic. I've spoken to people a lot older than you are who think they know a lot more about scouting, and they didn't have the right answer, which you have got. So you deserve a big clap.
Hey.
Now, I'll just finish off this bit and then we'll go on to Lisa. But Taylor, when he was on Brownsea Island, Baden Powell wrote 5 letters, which he sent out from Brownsea Island. Unfortunately, 3 of them were nothing at all to do with Brownsea Island, but 2 of them were. And I'm going to show you something now which you should always remember, because here is a letter This isn't a copy of a letter. This isn't a facsimile, a fake, a forgery. This is Baden Powell's letter that he sent out from Brownsea Island in 2007. Can you read what it says on the top, Chris?
Hang on.
Can't see it.
I am so sorry that I was. Could you lift it up a little bit, please? Yeah.
I'm
What does it
so
say?
sorry I was not able to see.
You're not. Well, I'm gonna show you. Just here, look where my finger is. It says Brownsea Island, Dorset, and that's because it was written on the paper belonging to the Van Rolts who own the island, who lived in a castle on Brownsea Island, where he stayed before the camp. So he used their letterheading paper. So there is a letter sent from Brownsea. But by the end of the camp, the newspaper man, who I told you his name was Pearson, that gave him £5,000, he sent a photographer to check up on Baden Powell to see what was the progress that they were making on Brownsea towards this new organisation that Baden Powell was going to found. And Baden Powell had ordered a new supply of writing paper. So here is the second letter sent from Brownsea Island by Baden Powell.
Hey.
Can you read what it says?
Thank you so much.
No, the heading.
Scouts Camp,
Scouts Camp,
Brownsea
Brownsea.
Island.
Ah.
Right. So here you've got two different ways you can win a pub quiz or to get money out of your scout leader. You can say, what was the Brownsea camp? And if they say it was a scout camp, you say, don't be silly, Skip. How can it be a scout camp? Because scouts weren't founded until January 1908. There was no law, there was no promise, and you need the law and the promise to be a scout, don't you? Yes. QED. That means I've won the argument. On the other hand, here we have a letter from the man that invented scouting, who's on Brownsea Island, and what does he call his camp?
Scout Camp.
The scout camp. So whichever way anybody argues, you can argue the other way. And have you noticed what's to the right of the scout?
Little fleur-de-lis.
The fleur-de-lis. That is the first ever use of a fleur-de-lis in connection with actual Boy Scouting as opposed to military scouting. Now, we can go on to the next question now then.
Yeah, okay.
Dylan. Can't hear you, Dylan. You've got to switch off the mute.
Yeah. Okay, try again, Dylan.
Thank you. Sorry, I've been unmuted now. I did try. I wasn't allowed. You were talking about Donald earlier, the young boy that was on the camp. How did you find out about him if he wasn't registered, if you will, on the camp in any books or anything?
Well, the quick answer is I showed you a photograph of him. Yes, but Baden Powell was a lifelong diary keeper, and I don't own his diaries, but I've been allowed to copy them down word for word from way back before the siege of Mafeking, right until he went to Africa to die in 1938. And amazingly, the week he was at Brownsea, he didn't actually keep a diary, except he just said at Brownsea. So we don't know, but he did write about it before, and he did write about it afterwards.
Right.
And the following year, Baden Powell took scouts camping at Humshoff in Northumberland, and he took Donald with him there. And there was a nice little story about him, because Donald went off by himself and he got lost. And of course, he's not Baden Powell's child. So Baden Powell's wondering what he's going to tell his sister about how he's come to lose her precious little child. And they searched for him all afternoon, no Donald. All evening, no Donald. And eventually, they went back to his tent. And there on the floor was a pile of old clothes. And underneath
was Donald.
Now, Donald lived to be a university professor at Cambridge University, just like Baden Powell's dad and his brother. So Donald spent a life in scouting, and of course he went to Brownsea, and his relative, who was the Lord Baden Powell that just died the other week, in my book, which I've written about Brownsea Island. Can you see the book on Brownsea Island?
Yeah.
Well, I got the best person possible to write the foreword, and the foreword was written by Lord Baden Powell, not the founder, but the founder's grandson. And he says, I'm going to read you what he says in the foreword. He says, my cousin Donald Baden Powell told us that the participants had been made to do so many things, such as making a rucksack from natural materials, wicker plate racks, etc., that each boy was overladen with stuff. As most of them had not really enjoyed the camp very much, that's what Lord Baden Powell said. After all, they were being used as experimental guinea pigs, and the sea was very choppy, enough to bring seasickness. They all felt wretched, and they just tipped everything over the side of the boat. Now, we're asked to believe that you are going to tip over the badges that Baden Powell, the hero of Mafeking, had given you. Can you believe that? No, I can't believe that. But on the other hand, nobody has ever seen one of these badges for real, which is why the one that I showed you was a replica. So if one of these badges, the most expensive scout badge ever known, was a silk scout badge for the 1920 World Jamboree, which 4,000 scouts attended. And one of those badges in good condition is worth £10,000. So how much do you think a brass badge made by Baden Powell himself for the very first scouts on Brownsea Island, how much do you think that would be worth?
1 million?
Absolute
£1 million?
fortune.
It'd be priceless.
So my advice to you is to do what I've done, is to get yourself to Brownsea with a bucket and spade and start digging in the sand, because Donald said that they just tipped the things over the side. Well, those boys that were in that boat, they were the posh kids. They were the public school boys. The boys from the Boys Brigade came back on the chain ferry across the shorter distance, which didn't cost as much money. And I don't think they would have chucked them away. But then there's always another side to the coin, like we've just talked about. Was it a scout camp? Was it not a scout camp? Did they destroy the badges or did they keep them? The fact is, nobody's ever seen one. So if they kept them, where are they? Next question.
Thank you very much, Doc.
Hands up, anybody got a question?
No, but I have got some embarrassing pictures of Ethan going to Brownsea Island when he was a cub.
Oh, what's
let's zoom in on
embarrassing about that? It looks
Hang on,
very
let's-
nice,
And we took a necker when we went down, and it went up in the Brownsea Island cabin down there.
Yeah, that's great.
Lanner having one there as
Well
well.
done. And it's a fantastic place. You know how all Muslims have to go to Mecca as a part of their religion? Well, I reckon all Scouts have to go to Brownsea. It is a fabulous place.
Yeah.
So it's great to walk. It's one of the, I mean, I know you have red squirrels in some parts of Wales, but there aren't many places in England, maybe only in the Lake District, where there are red squirrels. But there are red squirrels on Brownsea, and you can see the Founders Campsite, and it is a lovely place to go visit for the day.
They got a brilliant Founders Stone there as well, haven't they? Which has got the promise on. So it's a really good visit. We go every year.
Right, the monument, are you talking
Yeah.
about? The big
Yeah.
stone with the message on,
Mhm.
and they've got a statue, haven't they? A bust of Baden Powell. It's
Yeah.
a very emotive place for me.
Mm.
In 2007, at the World Jamboree in England, they had the sunrise ceremony
Morning.
on Brownsea Camp, and they had a replica camp of was a reenactment of the Brownsea boys. They had two teams, and some were girls, but two teams of boys and girls pretending to be the original campers. And the reason why they had two teams was they were on duty all day, every day. So they had to have a bit of a respite. So one team would go off and the other team would come on. So we dressed them up. We gave that badge you saw was the replica badge that they wore on their clothes. It wasn't a uniform because they didn't wear uniforms on Brownsea. And so I was on Brownsea for that. And that night before the camp, I gave a talk to the great and the good, we call them, who come from all over the world, including Michael Baden Powell, another grandson of Baden Powell, in Brownsea Castle. And I was able to say to them, I am very honoured to be here, standing before you today at this spot, at this time, because exactly 100 years ago to the day, Baden Powell stood in this room telling his host about the camp. And I did it 100 years later. There we go. Well, as we've established, Baden Powell was the most famous person in the British Army after the siege of Mafeking. And he was a career soldier. And from his army experiences, he brought into scouting lots of different things. The colours of our shirts, our khaki, which is the colour of a shirt of a British Army officer. Okay. Our fleur-de-lis started out in life as being an army badge. That was the other one that I showed you. And the first scouts wore what looks like a cowboy hat. I can see him in the room behind Chris's head here, look.
Yeah.
You can see all the scout hats on the wall. Well, Baden Powell decided that that was the best hat for his regiment that he founded to have after the siege of Mafeking. So he brought these things into the scouting from the army, including the neckerchief, which he got his regiment to wear in Africa. And so he was completely an army person. But I'm going to read you a letter now, which he sent to the father of Bob Roughton. Now, you'll remember that Bob Roughton was Baden Powell's senior patrol leader on Brownsea Island. So he's writing to Bob Roughton's father. Here's the letter here, look. And you can see that it's edged in black. Now, why was it edged in black? Because that's what you did when somebody died. You sent a letter of condolence, and it would be edged in black, and the envelope would be edged in black because the person had died. So he's writing this letter to Bob Roughton's father. It said, "My dear Roughton, thank you so much for letting me see those testimonies as to Bob's character." These were letters that lots of different people had sent in to Bob Roughton's father about what a good chap Bob Roughton was. And Baden Powell writes, "I have felt as nearly as is possible like a second father to Bob. And to read these letters after all the hopes that I had for him is the greatest possible comfort. I am so glad that he made his mark early before he died. And that must be a great comfort to you and his mother." So that's just a little indication that Baden Powell, on the death of his Brownsea boy, Bob Roughton, was grieving for him and felt very, very unhappy about it. And so in the First World War, when so many young scouts died, Baden Powell, he had said right in 1907, when he was developing Brownsea, when he was developing scouting and wrote the book, Scouting for Boys, 17 times in the book, Scouting for Boys, he mentions the word peace scouting. Scouting was not for war, scouting was for peace. But at the same time, scouting was for citizenship. And the whole idea, right back to the Mafeking cadets, was that boys can be trained to be useful in times of crisis. Now, we're in a crisis now. And there's things that you can do in your scout training that will help you to be useful after this particular part of the crisis is finished. You've all got the opportunity to take proficiency badges online. You've all got the opportunity to do training. And you've all got the opportunity to do what we've just been doing now outside banging drums and shouting and clapping to support other people. Scouts, Baden Powell said, are to be useful. So that's what it's all about. So thank you for listening to me. I hope you've been able to learn something, and I look forward to be able to talk to you again about what Scouts did in the Second World War.
Yeah. Yeah. So would you all like to say thank you to Colin for giving up his time and talking to you? All right. Say thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you.
Thanks, Colin.
Thank you.
Great being with you.
Yeah. All right then, guys. So it'll be. I'm not sure when we can get Colin again,